Protected Speech with Ravi Kapur and Jonathan Choe.
Greetings, everyone. Alongside Jonathan Choe, I'm Ravi Kapur with another edition of Protected Speech. We're going to now follow up on a program we did a couple of episodes ago because we've had some developments, and this topic is caste, which is difficult to talk about on television or in any form of media. But I wanted to follow up because I think there's been some interesting dialogue in this, and also we'll have a guest in just a bit, Pundit Satish Sharma, who has written literally the book on caste, and he's going to give us some more context. But I want to go back to the situation that took place in December, where Brown University decided to put a caste provision as part of their non-discrimination policy. It got some backlash because Brown was the first Ivy League university to do that. It was kind of a blanketed policy across the entire university. What's interesting about what Brown said is that they acknowledged that there have been no cases of caste discrimination at Brown, but this was done unilaterally to be more inclusive. Moreover, they also acknowledged that the existing discrimination policy would have included caste had such a situation arose. But there you have it, this press release that was sent out by Brown adding caste to their non-discrimination policy. Now, this is not the only university that's done that. Obviously, in recent months, we've had the Cal State University system add this, Brandeis University out in Boston, a number of schools around the country. And of course, there's been an effort throughout the nation to get this adopted by corporations as well. So Jonathan, quick thoughts on this. And actually, before I get into that, I want to also bring up the Wall Street Journal publishing a couple of op-eds, one by Suhag Shukla from the Hindu American Foundation, Suhag countering what Brown has said, and I kind of synopsized it there. And then, of course, Brown then responding to Suhag in brief. So this is an ongoing story. It's one that's nuanced. It's one that the average person in this country is not paying attention to, but it has a direct impact on Indian Americans and South Asians broadly throughout the U.S. Jonathan, thoughts before we bring on a real expert?
Yeah, and I do want to get to the real expert really quickly, but again, sort of as a layman and a journalist who's not part of the diaspora, but sort of trying to see what's happening from an outsider's lens. I mean, I have so many questions that are still unanswered. How did we get to this point? When did this movement really begin, and where does it go from here? And that's where I want to just kick it to Satish.
Joining us now to explain all this is author, pundit Satish Sharma. His book is called Caste Conversion, A Colonial Conspiracy, What Every Hindu and Christian Needs to Know About Caste.
It's a pleasure to be with yourself, Jonathan, and also with Raviji, and thank you for that overly generous introduction. In 2013, something started to happen here in the United Kingdom. And in fact, what started to happen now in the United States is exactly where we were at that time. So you're at the beginning of a journey which here in the UK, British Hindus and the British public went through. Now, that journey here in the United Kingdom concluded very rapidly once the details that are contained in the book were published. Once we presented our position to government actually then said, "Oh, we agree with you. This is bad law. This is unevidenced. No impact analysis has been done. No consultation with the target community who would be primarily affected has been done." And so the government at that time said, "No, we're not going to let this proceed." And they actually then held a public consultation. And the results of the public consultation were indisputable in that this problem did not exist. There was no evidence for it, and that what it was, it seemed to be an attempt to enshrine into law a prejudice. A prejudice, strictly speaking, is holding an adverse opinion without having any evidence to support it. That's what a prejudice is. And yet this was an attempt to enshrine a prejudice into law. And so we here in the United Kingdom were really delighted to see that the evidence, historical and contemporary, that we'd presented, really it deconstructed this trope that was being peddled. And we're hoping to see the same there in the United States. It's the same rascals, it's the same troublemakers, the same agitators who failed here in the United Kingdom, who then turned their attention to community cohesion and to a community which was well integrated, is pretty much not troublesome, it's trouble-free, and yet all of a sudden a vast array of allegations, a deluge of them, have now been unleashed in the United States. And we're seeing that this is actually creating conflict. I'll be more than happy to go into more details as to how we dismembered and deconstructed the tropes that were presented here in the United Kingdom, because I think that that would benefit the audience as well as the persons who are being impacted upon by this particular act of mischief.
So when did it get to the States? That's what I ultimately want to know. And you mentioned these agitators. Who are these agitators? Who is behind this right now?
Well, if we're going to be specific, Equality Labs are the principal protagonists in this space. And behind Equality Labs, there is a group of funders, there is a group of supporters, and by and large, if we were to try and give them a label, it's the group who are extremely unhappy with the indigenous resurgence of the Hindu and the Indian identity that's occurring as India decolonizes. India is in a process of trying to reconnect with its civilizational identity prior to when the Christianist evangelicals from Great Britain descended upon India and wreaked havoc for the best part of 300 years. Those groups are still sadly very much present. They have vested interests in ensuring that the indigenous identity in India doesn't manage to reintegrate itself and doesn't start to openly talk about what was done to it. And so this is why we're seeing a global resurgence of this. It's a valid question which I put to the both to the church and also to the legislators. I asked them, there is so much in India. How come even an individual in the remotest part of the United States has heard of the word caste? You know, this doesn't happen by coincidence that a particular word or a trope appears without significant force. And there is the evidence is there to support that this has been deliberately proliferated. In fact, to really understand it, I think it helps to bring to bear an understanding of Goebbels' rules about propaganda. If you have a look at how propaganda and hate speech and hate tropes are created and then proliferated, all of a sudden, this whole exercise starts to take on a different shape. And then I think you start to see clearly the intent as well as the actors behind the intent.
Well, Pundit Sharma, you brought up a group that we've been covering for the last few years, Equality Labs, and we actually had a chance to have a conversation with the principal of Equality Labs, the founder and the executive director, Tenmosi Sunarajan. We got a chance to catch up with her after she won an award at the South Asian Bar Association. It was a social justice award, and in the aftermath of receiving that on stage, we had a chance to talk to her. I wanted to play a couple minutes of her comments to us after she received the award, and get your thoughts on what she's saying and the validity of her of this discussion, because it's widespread, and again, she has incredible influence here in the U.S. amongst a number of these organizations. Let's take a look at what Tenmosi Sunarajan has to say.
Talk a little bit about, most recently with the Google talk and everything that's come down the pipeline with the Santa Clara Human Rights Commission. Equality Labs has, some would describe as a controversial relationship within the South Asian community. How do you navigate that, and how do you, counter those who say that, it was specifically as it relates to Google, it was said that the work that you're doing is divisive. So how do you counter that?
Well, I think we've always seen civil rights struggles be met with a small group of bigots, people that want to stand, opposite to the progress. And I think what's fascinating at this moment right now is that just like this award, there are millions of South Asian Americans that want to see caste discrimination end. So unfortunately, while there are those who are unhappy with Dalits being given equitable access to American institutions, overwhelmingly the South Asian community is unified in order to be able to add caste as a protected category.
Why add caste as a separate protected category?
Well, clearly, from our own data, we know that 1 in 4 Dalits experience physical and verbal assault, 2 out of 3 workplace discrimination, and 1 out of 3 educational discrimination. So there are times when our civil rights codes are not sufficient to meet the needs of communities that are facing deep and grave discrimination. So when we add caste as a protected category, caste-oppressed people are able to get our equal access under the law. And frankly, just my own experience at Google proved that. When I got this award, I was in a safe house because of bigots that wanted to make sure Dalit women couldn't come out and talk about the experiences we face around discrimination. So this is a civil rights journey that will not be denied, and I really encourage even those that feel threatened by the prospect of Dalits achieving equity, join us, because we do not want to pass this scourge to the next generation.
Now, Dalits are obviously a micro minority, and so are the larger South Asian community, the Hindus, the Muslims, the Sikhs within this community. We are all still minorities in this country. So how do you reconcile the fact that bringing caste as a protected category could potentially, disadvantage the Hindu American community, or the Sikh American community, or the the South Asian Muslim American community, which all have their versions of caste in it?
So civil rights laws are not set up to disadvantage any community. They're actually set up to ensure access for all communities. And with each of these multinational corporations, they already have caste as a protected category for their South Asian countries. They have simply omitted it for their North American divisions, even though they have high amounts of South Asians. But for a company like Google, that makes no sense. One team might have members in India, in the United States, and in Europe. So you should have one policy that addresses all of those communities, and we shouldn't have patchwork policies, because otherwise the companies are failing their duty of care towards caste-oppressed communities and religious minorities.
Pandit Sharma, thoughts on what Tanmosi Sundararajan had to say there?
Where does one begin? Okay, firstly, we reached out to the groups who were here in the United Kingdom wanting to enshrine caste into law. We repeatedly said, come and talk to us. If this phenomenon does exist, the first step should be, come and sit around a table with us, tell us what's happening, give us the evidence, because according to our lived experience in the United Kingdom, and when I say lived experience, I've been here for 55 years. I've worked with over 400 temples up and down the country. We have never had an instance where somebody has come forward and said, I've been denied entry or I've been discriminated in the public sphere or indeed in the private sphere on this basis. So we appealed to them. We said, come and sit and talk with us. They didn't do so. They refused to. Here in the United Kingdom, we have a community who notionally, according to the framework that Equality Labs are putting forward, would be classed as Dalits. And we reached out to that organization, over 27,000 members of this organization. And the response from their president was to us, we don't think of ourselves as suffering. Why on earth should we say we now want to subscribe to this sort of a framework? Our children are lawyers, they're financiers. Why on earth would we want to be bundled up into this little victim group that this group are talking about? And in fact, their contribution was one of the key determinants which empowered the government to reject this out of hand. And I also know that in the United States, there are groups which are in exactly the same position who say, stop pushing us into this pigeonhole. So there is an issue here. Somebody who genuinely wants to resolve a problem, you would sit down with the groups or the persons who are actually causing you a difficulty. They have not done so. Nowhere have they done so. What they have done is they have rushed with allegations, with stories of victimhood. This young lady has just said that they are subjected to physical abuse on the basis of some sort of an identifier in the United States. I would love to see the evidence. Has any person actually come forward in the United States and said, I have been physically targeted and abused because of my identity? Has it been proven? Has it come in front of justice? You see, the bigger picture is that you have United States citizens, and the benefits of being a citizen in a country is that you're entitled to equality in front of the law. And those citizens who are Hindus in the United Kingdom and in the United States are actually being deprived of their right to be treated as innocent prior to being proven guilty. This was also a fundamental aspect of this attempt to enshrine the notion of some hierarchical system into law, and that was also accepted by the legislators. You know, we all have a desire not to see anybody suffer in the manner in which has been described. But equally, we do not want to see the creation of consciousness of this trope in our communities and our generations. And the work that I did, we proved and demonstrated exactly the mechanism whereby caste consciousness was created as typical standard divide and rule politics that the British played all over the world. And they accepted that the evidence was irrefutable as well. So although this young lady is appealing to our better sense, and it triggers compassion when you hear a young lady actually taking that approach and claiming victimhood, each of us wants to leap forward and say, no, this is wrong. But when you then scrutinize the evidence, when you then ask to sit and have a conversation, you will find that the table is actually remarkably empty. And this is a real problem. This is the creation of a problem, the creation of consciousness of a problem where no problem exists.
And this is the exact playbook we're now starting to see in the States. And I want to, before we get into that, because very few, especially in the mainstream media, will even follow up and scrutinize the allegations or the claims, right? And we move on, and then this narrative starts to form. And again, just in the past few years, I want to get down to the timeline. When do you believe this came over to the States?
I would say we're in 2022. I'd say 2017 was the first time that I heard rumblings of this.
Actually,
And
I think
as
we're
I,
in 2023 now, at least the early parts of
sorry, 2023.
Right.
As
What
I,
I'm asking is, as we know, this global movement back in roughly 2020, the Black Lives Matter movement, it really was a racial reckoning in the U.S., right? And again, the Black Lives Matter, ended up, as we now know, at least the global nonprofit is accused of fraud. Um, but what came about from that is that so many different groups with different agendas decided to use that as a rallying cry. And I'm just wondering, do you feel like this movement that was started really in the UK sort of really started, gaining more relevance and a voice with every other social justice protest and movement that was exploding in the US around that time?
I think there is a distinct strategy to try and camouflage themselves amongst the company of people who have genuine complaints. And the African American experience is a horrific episode in human history. The experience of the indigenous Americans is a horrific episode in human history. And they have absolutely valid claims, which this group does not have the pedigree nor the credibility. It hasn't established that those claims are real. What it has done is engaged in an extraordinary exercise of propaganda and of proliferating and creating the problem themselves, which they are supposedly wanting to see disappear, and then somehow have attached themselves to emotionally connected themselves with groups who have a very real complaint. And it's a very worrying trend. The data is the only thing that I think can salvage this situation. If we focus on demanding a very credible level of data, then you will find that this whole escapade dissipates. And in fact, the sooner we can do that, the sooner we can detach them from the legitimate claims and the legitimate pursuit of justice, which many other groups are pursuing. But it's a disingenuous and it's a tragic, and I would say it's a very, very unpleasant and cynical way of appropriating somebody else's suffering purely and solely to propel your own political motives.
Let me take the counter view here, Pundit Sharma.
Please.
Obviously, she has an incredible knowledge of what it takes to appeal to DEI executives, folks that are trying to bring more an inclusive America, to bring people together. So the language is there, but she also uses very strong language like bigotry. And I don't think anyone wants to be called a bigot. And so thus, here we are, when someone comes to you and says, listen, this is a way to eliminate bigotry and hate, most executives will go along with that. So what do you have to say then about the fact that here we are as three men arguing this case? She's going to point to a lot of women that are traumatized, that are victimized. There are a lot of folks of ostensibly backgrounds that are not elite that are facing challenges. Speak about that, because this is, I think, where largely this is going to, because the Indian community, in particular in the United States, came here to get master's degrees, PhDs, became part of the elite workforce, And we did not have folks, just kind of the common folks, so to speak, enter the United States until much later on. We had truly talented people that were brought to the U.S. first and foremost. So, what do you have to say to some of those arguments that she will make?
It's wonderful. I would love to see the evidence, but just consider what's being done. How do you stigmatize a community? You create some sort of an allegation, you produce a victim, you create a hierarchy, you create some sort of, you identify some sort of difference, and then you infuse it with passionate appeals to emotion. This whole exercise immediately stigmatizes every Hindu who is not a Dalit. Is that just? And it's so obvious. When we were having this conversation here in the United Kingdom, I even suggested to the legislators, I said, look, if this phenomenon exists, the word caste is Portuguese, it means class. If you genuinely want to get conflict that is enshrined in some sort of class hierarchy, put the word class in. We'd be really happy. And everybody then gets additional protections. Imagine putting that word class in, because class is the English equivalent of the word caste, and it would give everybody the justice that they're seeking. And then we could turn to the phenomenon itself and see whether it exists and apply justice on that benchmark. They refused. They said, no, it has to be caste. Why? Because in everybody's consciousness, caste is a brand. It's a hate brand which is attached to a particular community. And their adherence and determination not to abandon the word caste and take a preference for the word class, it does reveal a great deal about who the target of this exercise is.
So I want to talk about what's happening really on the front lines then, outside of
Sure.
academia, outside of the diaspora. You have folks now, especially on the East Coast and West Coast here in the States, in academic circles and schools, also in tech circles, who, again, are not Indian or South Asian. And they're like, what are you guys talking about? But the moment I then say class, then they start to understand. And then they'll also say, oh, wait a second, we're having those issues as well in the US. It's just not called caste. So it's really interesting. So at this point, where do you feel like this conversation is going to go? Because it's such a big deal, again, in this diaspora, and that's why we're talking about it right now. But outside of it, I'm asking because aside from Equality Labs, we have another massive voice here in Rutgers University professor Audrey Truschke, who is a white woman who is at the forefront of this and pushing this agenda. Your thoughts on that?
Yes, we've been monitoring her work for a long period of time, and again have sought many opportunities and created opportunities to engage in an academic conversation, to have a look at the history, to have a look at the scriptures which supposedly provide the foundations for this ideology, and somehow which seem to perpetuate it across the centuries. And every single opportunity is rejected. There is no participation in any academic fora. It is classic trope construction. And it's only a question of time before the truth and the irrationality behind these escapades is revealed in front of everybody. As we managed to do it here in the United Kingdom, it took us 2 years. And when we presented everything and made it so clear that we were very much determined ourselves to prevent any prejudices, to prevent any discrimination occurring, all of a sudden it dissipated. It took us from 2013 to 2016 to do that. And then all of a sudden, lo and behold, the same phenomenon seems to have sprouted in the United States. So we don't have any issue in dealing with this particular campaign. It is nothing other than proliferating a hate trope with the intention of stigmatizing one religious community by name. And like all hate tropes, I think when they are subjected to the scrutiny of wise, calm, genuinely independent, unbiased scholars, academics, and litigators, they dissipate, and this too will dissipate. And personally, I think it's a wonderful thing. If it dissipates in the United States, then we will see this whole campaign, this pogrom of stigmatization of the Hindu community collapse globally.
Well, it's been a fascinating debate, and I wanted to go back to what Tenmozi had said in that soundbite, because she just a few weeks before we did that interview, she was disinvited from speaking at Google. Now, she was invited to speak at Google through their news division, and they had, I believe, an Indian American woman who was involved in the news division, Google News, which is very influential globally, have her speak, and then she was disinvited because it could cause some, obviously discord amongst the Google staff, of which there are many South Asians, and she was able to, obviously she protested that, but nothing came of it. But it's an interesting playbook which is going on in terms of reaching out to these tech companies which have outsized influence, which also have a ton of Indian American staffers. Can you speak to the fact that she mentioned that there's a lot of companies that are working in India, for example, that have caste discrimination laws on the books, and she says they're not being ascribed to the United States, and she wants them to be. What do you have to say to that aspect of what she has to say?
You see, discrimination amongst classes in India has been part of statute and law for a long, long period of time. I think way before even independence, there were statutes covered this particular issue, even though there was no evidence that this was occurring. Remember, for 75 years, India has had a policy of positive discrimination, supposedly, to make some sort of restitution for ancestral, imagined, unrecorded transgressions that were being inflicted by a 2.5% community on the rest of the 97% community of India. So India's situation is, that's been dealt with entirely. But just turning back to this Google issue, how wonderful would it have been if she had actually been allowed the opportunity to speak, but there had been somebody to present a counter narrative as well? That would have been a genuine engagement. That would have been truly two persons, both wanting to ensure that injustices didn't occur, having a conversation, looking for a particular solution. But that doesn't happen. This is a hallmark of the manner in which this campaign has been conducted. It is an attempt to appeal to emotion because the evidence is lacking, and it's a very, very fragile pogrom that they've put together. Jonathan, I think you really touched on this right at the beginning when you said this follows a profile. It's a symptomatic, it's a strategy, isn't it, which is rolled out time and time again. If you can identify any group as a victim in some way, shape or form, then the onus seems to be no longer upon you to prove the victimhood status that you have adopted, but the onus seems to be being pushed on people to prove their innocence. And this is something that must be really refused and rejected time and time again. A standard policy of law is that every human being, according to human rights and legislation and the principles of justice, has the right to be treated and assumed to be innocent prior to being judged guilty. The process of innocence and then evidence and then scrutiny and then guilt being established, that's what's being targeted by these people.
And I want to make sure I get this in before we wrap up here. I'll give you the final question, Ravi. But I have many Indian friends who subscribe to the Hindu faith, all across the country, and they don't want to get involved, right? Because they don't want to be labeled anti this or anti that. Look, they just want to work hard, keep their head down, raise their families. Yet at the same time, this is a movement that is happening. And I wanted to know at this point, what is the responsibility, do you feel like, of someone who says, hey, I'm a Hindu, I love India, but I don't want to get involved with this controversy because I don't want to be painted a bigot or part of a hate group? Because I think that a lot of Hindus that I know who are like, hey, man, I don't want to get involved. Yet what is their responsibility? What can they do in the U.S.?
They have no choice in the matter, to be perfectly honest, because they are being targeted. They are being stigmatized, whether they wish to or not. And I'll give you a very real example of what happened here in the United Kingdom, which really helped us to emphasize the problems. Imagine a doctor treating a patient, and the doctor determined that the patient needed an injection and advised the patient that they should consult one of the nurses, and the nurse would administer the injection. The patient in this instance complained to the hospital and said, I am low caste, he is high caste, and the reason he didn't want to administer that injection is because he doesn't want to touch me. Fortunately, the hospital had a policy in place where the nurses had been trained to administer injections, and it was standard practice. And so the doctor in question was able to say, well, actually, no, here's this policy that I was actually agreeing to. But imagine if that policy hadn't been there. How on earth would he have been able to establish his innocence? Because the system would have been created, a framework would have been created, which would automatically require them to be assumed as being guilty just by virtue of the fact of their surname, by virtue of the fact of some historical lineage. And that's the threat. So it doesn't matter. In fact, it goes beyond the Hindu community. It goes to, this should reach every person who wants to see that principle of law, that innocence must be maintained until proven guilty. If you want to see that maintained, you have to get involved in this. And every Hindu has a responsibility to do this. Remember, the community that who supposedly this group are now claiming to be representatives of has not given them representative authority. Here in the United Kingdom, we established, they joined with us to defeat this program. And I know that there are groups in the US as well who are saying, no, we do not want to be stigmatized in this manner. And that's key. This is going to be something that everybody needs to get engaged with. The principles that are being deployed, the strategy that's being deployed, it creates conflict under the guise of supposedly delivering justice. And we've seen how that principle and strategy is applied in many other instances, whether it's the conversation about gender and whether it's the conversation about pronouns. Supposedly, all of these are appeals and programs to seek justice. And yet what they do is they create conflict because that's their intention. If you want divide and rule, you want chaos, then you have to create this identity conflict. And this is a classic case of the nurturing, the creation of a identity conflict.
Pundit Sharma, we'll let you go with this. Why should anyone outside of the diaspora, outside of India or South Asia broadly, or if you're not directly affected, why should anyone else care about this matter?
Because of the principle involved, Raviji. As I said, we have only just now come out of almost 2,000 years of the Jewish community being stigmatized by things such as William Shakespeare wrote a play in which he portrayed the Jew as Shylock. And that stigmatized the whole of the Jewish community. We have people in religious garb who stigmatize the Jewish community by claiming that they were somehow all collectively responsible for an assumed crime against Christ. This is the manner in which tropes become larger and they expand. And this situation with the Hindu community, this is a particularly pernicious reworking of that same strategy. And if we want to see this strategy shown the door and for it to disappear amongst our political discourse, amongst our justice-based and judicial discourse, then we have to defeat this strategy wherever it arises. We successfully, in this instance, managed to prove that caste as a concept had nothing to do with the Hindu religion. We produced the historical records where evangelicals were creating caste-based divide in India in 1844, and it's documented in my book. And a time will come when we will look back on this instance and we will be able to say, here's exactly when it started. These are the groups who did it. Their intentions was in fact malicious. It wasn't a search for justice. And we saw them off because we understood the principle whereby hate is created to divide communities. That's the larger picture, and that's what we have to all address.
Pundit Satish Sharma, thank you so much for joining us. He's the author of Caste, Conversion, A Colonial Conspiracy, What Every Hindu and Christian Needs to Know About Caste. Thank you again so much for joining us.
It's been my pleasure. Jonathan, a pleasure to be in a show with you. Look forward to future engagements. Best wishes to everybody.
Thank you. And now we're going to move on to a non-caste related topic. We took up a lot of time on this program to talk about that. But Jonathan, as everyone knows, has been covering the homeless crisis extensively in Seattle specifically. But obviously he's got a purview around the country. And you had a chance to convene with some of the thought leaders around the country on homelessness.
Yeah, it was a real privilege to be invited to this initial gathering of thought leaders, academics, activists, homeless outreach groups, people with this lived experience, formerly homeless, recovering addicts, and this coalition formed really in response to what we're seeing on the streets of the West Coast, the Pacific Northwest, and even some of the larger cities on the East Coast like New York and Philadelphia. The homeless crisis, the drug addiction crisis, the fentanyl pouring over from the borders, from China, from Mexico, really destabilizing this country, and the current policies just not working. Policies like housing first, where politicians believe that they can build their way out of the homeless crisis by giving apartments and studios to stabilize homeless addicts, but there's no accountability or follow up to require treatment for mental illness or addiction. So this coalition got together to say enough is enough. What is going to be the counter to this harm reduction narrative where this massive multi-billion-dollar lobby is just giving away needles? You know, we heard about needle exchange. It's not a needle exchange. It's a one-way street. And that's why if you go to any homeless encampment in San Francisco, Sacramento, Seattle, Portland, New York, you're going to see needles and pipes strewn about everywhere. And now this scourge of fentanyl with the foil just floating around the streets of Seattle like leaves blowing in the wind. This coalition said, look, we've got to take matters into our own hands. We cannot allow this harm reduction, housing first lobby and the current policies to continue, because this country is going to be in decay. So I saw firsthand what was happening. So we'll see where this goes.
Yeah, and who brought this coalition together, and what is the intent? Is there an action plan moving forward?
Yeah, it was so early. It was just, I had a privilege to kind of be a fly on the wall, just kind of this brainstorming session. But a lot of heavy hitters in this space. Michael Schellenberger, the author of several books, including San Francisco. He was also invited in to drop one of the Twitter files by Elon Musk. So he's sort of brought this group together, and through his contacts, as well as an outreach group here in Seattle called We Heart Seattle. They just this grassroots organization led by Andrea Suarez, this rocket of energy, just taking matters into her own hands as she saw the city lawmakers and policymakers just failing to address the homeless crisis. She's been mobilizing volunteers, just average folks, to get out of their homes and hit the streets to address this homeless crisis by just helping people volunteer, cleaning up trash at encampments, and then in some cases leading to actual outreach and people getting housed. So that's what I saw. And then the cherry on top is, a lot of these folks who are kind of used to this, the Tom Wolfes, a well-known advocate now in San Francisco, as well as folks from Portland and other parts of the nation, and including Texas and Las Vegas. I brought them on this tour here in downtown Seattle, some of the hot spots that I've been covering. And without fail, we saw people literally doing fentanyl in front of us, open air drug use, the black market of stolen goods, just impacting San Francisco as well. I mean, Ravi, you've seen people literally on video, maybe even in person, go into the Walgreens and just walk right out. Yeah, some of those are criminal gangs and rings, but in many cases, they're addicts who are just trying to fuel their addiction by stealing items and reselling it for pennies on the dollar so they can buy more drugs.
It seems like it's a story that you cover every single day, because it actually is. And I'm really intrigued to see where this coalition goes, because there's a related topic to what you saw in Seattle that we also have to bring about, involving a homeless woman in San Francisco. There's a gentleman who's an art gallery dealer, been there for many years, and he's been trying to confront homeless folks out front of his facility in San Francisco, and he finally snapped. And the video is quite graphic. Frankly, it's gone bonkers viral. It shows this man literally pouring water through a garden hose on this homeless woman in San Francisco, caught on video. Obviously, he has been ridiculed.
That's a jet stream spray right to the face.
Right. I mean, what's interesting about this particular situation is that while I don't think he's received much empathy, other than the fact that he's a business owner like so many that's been struggling during this period of COVID. Obviously, there's not one person I can tell that is defending him for reacting this manner, and he's apologized for what it's worth. He's apologized.
Not quite. He hasn't apologized for that actually officially.
Well, I think he has backtracked. I have seen some interviews he's done with other media houses saying he should not have reacted, that he
Correct.
snapped.
Yeah, but
But
that's not an apology. And I think you bring up a good point. The real question we need to be asking is, how did we get to this point? Where society now, where you have people who feel like they can't rely on their policymakers and their elected officials to address this homeless crisis, so they have to take matters into their own hands. Again, the backstory is not just some random guy who I believe his name is Collier Gwynn, the owner of this art gallery. I mean, he said it now. This has been going on for weeks. The same homeless woman, clearly who has an addiction issue or mental illness, in the same spot harassing customers and people walking by. And he just snapped. Enough is enough. The fact that we've gotten to this point, that society, that our lawmakers, our policymakers, elected officials are allowing it to get to this point, I think that's the real question that needs to be asked, not just the actions of this gentleman and unfortunately this poor homeless woman who just is a victim here as well.
right. I mean, prior to this modern era, I mean, was there a lot of vigilante justice in the past? I would say yes. There's a lot of people who take matters into their own hands if law enforcement is not doing the job. And look, I'm a San Francisco native, but I am greatly disappointed at how they handled this. The homeless woman in question needs to get help. And this gentleman who's trying to keep his business going shouldn't have to go for weeks at a time trying to handle the situation in front of his business. But of course, the government in San Francisco has been non-responsive, and it's greatly disappointing. And he should not have done that at all. We'll see what the fallout is. Obviously, I think it's going to be very hard for him to conduct business moving forward, and we'll see if he gets charged.
Well, the online trolls are just decimating him right now. His Google, 5-star reviews gone down to like 1 star. And,
sure.
Obviously you have everyone coming out of the woodwork, some calling him a monster, but others calling him a hero for essentially doing exactly what others have always wanted to do, but just haven't had the guts. Look, I want to be very clear. I'm not for this type of behavior at all. I don't believe in taking matters into your own hands in this manner. I mean, it was cold. It was 49 degrees. But I understand at the very least why this business owner did this. I don't condone it. I'm not here to justify it, but I understand. This goes back to what we were talking about earlier. The current policies are not working. The housing first, the harm reduction, it's not working. If it was working, you would see the streets of San Francisco, Seattle, Portland clear. But it's not. The crisis is getting worse. Yet why do we keep throwing billions of taxpayer dollars at the same solutions that are not working? There's no accountability whatsoever. That's the question we need to be asking. At the end of the day, this man Collier Gwynn, this homeless woman, they are dealing with failed policies.
Now to a somewhat related topic, another episode of AAPI Hate. We had, an episode of a gentleman snapping in San Francisco. This is another Bay Area incident involving 2 people sitting at their table at an In-N-Out, filming a TikTok, which admittedly, maybe we're not of the generation to film our food on TikTok, but these young people were filming a TikTok, discussing their food, and apparently it offended this guy who's not from the Bay Area, but to the point where they felt threatened. Yeah, it's stunning that someone would feel so upset by 2 people talking to their cell phone in this day and age, but here we are. And so these young people, a young Korean woman posts this TikTok about being harassed, and obviously it goes viral. And the man actually ends up getting arrested. The gentleman in question harassing these 2 people sitting there with their food, it has now received charges. And yet another episode of AAPI Hate we've been documenting here on this program, again sponsored by the California Public Library. This segment, Jonathan, I mean, this keeps happening. It's part of the reason we're highlighting it on every program. But it's stunning to see people who are just minding their own business getting harassed in this way.
Yeah, and I just want to add that you say harassment, to be really specific. He allegedly threatened to spit in their face, yelled homophobic slurs, threatened them, and he didn't do it to just this couple. He did it to other Asian Americans in the restaurant as well, apparently. So This is ongoing. I'm glad that we live in the age of social media now, because I can't imagine. The data shows Asian Americans, especially seniors, due to language barriers, stigma, tend to not report these hate incidents as much. But in this age of social media, you better be careful, man. And everyone's got a phone, and the moment you go off, you're likely going to get recorded. So, again, I'm glad these two young folks are okay. I'm sure rattled after this incident, but Asian hate is alive and well, and that's why we're still in business. That's why we have this segment, man.
It's wild. I mean, just completely innocuous, something that you see 100 times. People are filming TikToks and they're taking videos of themselves, taking selfies, and this guy had a problem with it. But
And trying to enjoy a burger and fries, right?
just ridiculous stuff. But once again, we have to spotlight it. Well, this has been an interesting edition of Protected Speech. For Jonathan Choe, I'm Ravi Kapur. We'll see you again next time.